This presentation will seek to provide information around the processes companies should undertake when assessing whether they may be eligible to register under the R&D tax incentive. This presentation has been based on a guidance document published by AusIndustry titled Guide to Interpretation. The document and other helpful publications are available for download on the AusIndustry website. The R&D tax incentive operates on a self-assessment framework. That is, companies lodge their R&D applications based on their own assessment of eligible activities. Subsequently, they may have to substantiate their activities at a later time if their claim is selected for review. The recommended self-assessment process for claimants in the AusIndustry guidance is as follows. Firstly, consider if your company is an eligible R&D entity. This usually means an incorporated entity. Then, consider if you have undertaken eligible R&D activities. Consider if you can accurately identify expenditure incurred undertaking the R&D activities. Finally, ensure that you have kept records which describe what you did, the expenditure you have incurred, and the connection between the expenditure incurred and the activities conducted. Next, we will focus on the assessment of the eligible activities element of this self-assessment process. For the purposes of assessment under the R&D tax incentive, activities will be either eligible core R&D activities, eligible supporting R&D activities, or ineligible activities not to be registered. In order to register eligible activities in any given year, a company must have undertaken or be intending to undertake at least one core R&D activity. When assessing if a company can register activities, consider: have you undertaken or are you intending to undertake at least one core R&D activity? Have you checked that the activity is not specifically excluded from being a core R&D activity? And have you undertaken supporting R&D activities? A company may have a year where they only undertake supporting activities. However, these must be directly related to a core activity. That core activity may have been undertaken in previous years, or it may be planned for a future year. The definition of eligible core R&D activities is specified in the income tax legislation. Here you will see the legislation states, core R&D activities are experimental activities. A, whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience, but can only be determined by applying a systematic progression of work that 1. Is based on principles of established science, and 2. Proceeds from hypothesis to experiment, observation and evaluation, and leads to logical conclusions, and B. Are conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge. This includes new knowledge in the form of new or improved materials, products, devices, processes, or services. Each of the requirements of the legislative definition must be met to qualify, and during compliance reviews, AusIndustry needs to be satisfied that a company has met each of these relevant criteria. If a particular part of a project is not a core R&D activity, it may still qualify as a supporting R&D activity. These diagrams from the AusIndustry guidance provide an illustration of how each of the 3 key requirements of the overall core R&D activity test interact. The process of conducting a core activity is particularly noteworthy, as this aligns with how AusIndustry like to see projects presented during compliance assessments. A strong core R&D activity will be one that sequentially describes 1. The hypothesis being tested, 2. The design and operation of experiment, including the key variables, 3. Observation and evaluation of results, which lead to 4. Logical conclusions being made. We will now go into each phase of the experiment in a little more detail. The first element of the experiment is the hypothesis. Whether a hypothesis is valid for R&D tax purposes will be a key focus for assessment in the event of Oz industry compliance activities taking place. A hypothesis is simply a statement that can be proven right or wrong by conducting an experiment. It is the idea being investigated during experiments and will direct the design and undertaking of the experiment. The observation and evaluation will also be derived from the hypothesis. For R&D tax purposes, a valid hypothesis must reflect a particular technical or scientific idea. Commonly, they are expressed as a relationship between variables, which can be proven or disproven. It is important that the hypothesis relates to a specific experiment or set of related experiments and not the project as a whole. It must focus on the technical or scientific area of uncertainty and not be framed in terms of any commercial or economic aims. The Oz Industry Guide to Interpretation provides some examples of hypotheses. An example of appropriate hypotheses that can be tested in experiments to investigate relationships between variables and proven as true or false include the following. Applying the company's newly developed data processing algorithms to astronomical data sets of more than 1 terabyte in size will yield results appropriate for generating 3D visual depictions of areas of outer space in real time. And combining a new polyurethane with metal flakes that have been coated with magnesium fluoride to a general water-based paint will produce a glossy, stable, two-coat metallic paint without the need for a coat of clear lacquer. The guidance also provides an example of an insufficient hypothesis, where there is no way to disprove and it is unclear what is being specifically tested. This unsuitable hypothesis reads, where the particular computer software can be developed to include the latest research from the planning community. Once the hypothesis is defined, the next step is to identify the experiment. It is important to note that the experiment is what you did to test the hypothesis, i.e., the activities you undertake. The experiment should be conducted in order for the relationship between relevant variables to be tested, which allows for the hypothesis to be proven right or wrong. A series of experiments may be grouped as one core R&D activity, providing they seek to test the same hypothesis or related hypotheses. It is expected that experiments are conducted in order to make observations. This is the next key phase of describing the core activity. Observation and evaluation refers to the observing, measuring, and recording of information and the results from the experiment. This allows an assessment of the experiment and its outcomes and whether it worked as expected. Observations allow you to analyze, consider, and evaluate what the outcomes of the experiment actually mean. This then leads on to the final stage of describing the core activity, being the making of conclusions. Logical conclusions will bring together the results which inform onward decisions in regards to whether or not the hypothesis has been proven or disproven. Where the conclusion is inconsistent with the initial hypothesis, a company will generally consider what they have to do differently and as a result try again. Or, if the hypothesis is proven, a company can then consider whether they now have the knowledge required to continue to the next stage of development of the new product, service, or process for which they are seeking the new knowledge. In addition to showing an experimental process, a key requirement of core activities is that the outcome of the hypothesis being tested could not be determined in advance without conducting experiments. The unknown outcome identified must focus on specific technical or scientific concepts and ideas and establish what is being done to investigate those ideas and concepts. As noted, in other words, establishing the causal relationships among relevant variables. Whether an outcome can be known or determined in advance without applying a systematic progression of work is judged A. on the basis of current global knowledge, information and/or experience that is publicly available and reasonably accessible, and B. whether a competent professional working in the field could be reasonably expected to know or to readily deduce the outcome, i.e., whether the hypothesis is true or false, without conducting an experiment as part of a systematic progression of work. In this regard, a competent professional is a person who is knowledgeable and experienced in the relevant field of science and/or technology, possesses the relevant qualifications and experience necessary to have a reasonable level of skill, keeps up to date with developments in the area, and has access to knowledge around the world, including access to publicly and generally accessible resources. AusIndustry also need to understand the steps a company have taken to establish that the knowledge being sought was not available prior to the conducting of experiments, and whether any existing solutions could be identified. If the knowledge sought by the experiment was available to the company without undertaking an experiment, it would not be eligible for R&D tax purposes. It is for these reasons that claimants must be able to show that they have conducted research to establish the available information, for example, accessing scientific, technical, or professional literature in the relevant area, and sought advice from an expert or experts in the field. AusIndustry guidance acknowledges that if you need to design and conduct an experiment to progress your work, then it is more likely that the outcome cannot be known or determined in advance on the basis of current knowledge, information, or experience. AusIndustry guidance also acknowledges that where knowledge and information is commercially sensitive, held closely by a competitor, and is not available to the general public, it is not considered to be reasonably accessible. The next key eligibility component that a company must show is that core activities have been or will be conducted for the purpose of generating new knowledge. AusIndustry guidance concedes that there can be multiple purposes for conducting an experiment, and knowledge generation does not need to be the sole purpose. However, the generation of new knowledge must be a significant purpose, and the generation of new knowledge must be a significant driving force for the undertaking of the core activity. The purpose of an experiment can be substantiated via records, including, but by no means limited to, plans, minutes, and internal memos or emails. AusIndustry are likely to give greater credit to documentation that is produced and dated from the outset of the activity and justifies the relevant purposes. It is also important to note that knowledge generation must be a purpose at the time the activities are undertaken. AusIndustry guidance states that it is insufficient to undertake activities for another purpose, only to later discover that activities also happened to generate new knowledge. As previously discussed, it should be remembered that the experiment must seek to generate knowledge that is new to the world. New knowledge, for R&D tax purposes, is that which is not already available in the public arena at the time the activities were conducted. It is knowledge that can only be generated by undertaking an experiment as part of a systematic progression of work. AusIndustry guidance emphasizes that if you are able to access the desired knowledge without needing to undertake a systematic progression of work, then it will not be new knowledge. To conclude the section of this presentation on core activities, it is important to note that there are certain activities that are specifically ineligible to be registered as core activities. These include market research, prospecting, exploration or drilling, management studies or efficiency surveys, research into social sciences, arts or humanities, patenting, licensing or other IP protection activities, complying with statutory requirements or specific standards, reproduction of a commercial product or process, and finally, software development where the use is internal administration. Claimants should ensure that any potential core activities do not fall within these categories. The points discussed so far are in respect of the criteria for core R&D activities. It is important to note that the activities which are not experimental themselves but are required in order for the experiment to occur can still be qualifying activities and, therefore, registered. These are supporting activities. Supporting R&D activities are activities that are directly related to specific core activities. Examples of how supporting R&D activities can be directly related to core R&D activities provided in the Oz Industry Guidance includes a literature search on durability testing which informed the design of the experiment to effectively test the hypothesis. The supporting R&D activity produced a test rig used in the experiment. The supporting R&D activity manufactured a small batch of new design syringes which were used in the experiment. It is important to note that where supporting activities are related to the production of goods or services, a dominant purpose test will apply. That is, the activities have been undertaken for the dominant purpose of supporting specific core R&D activities. Each supporting activity registered must be directly related to one or more core R&D activities. They must have a direct, close, and relatively immediate relationship with one or more of the components of the relevant systematic progression of work. Supporting R&D activities may be conducted before, during, or after a core R&D activity is conducted. The key is that supporting activities must be directly related to the conduct of registered core R&D activities. Examples from the guidance of supporting activities relevant to different stages of a project include before a core, a literature review to inform the design of the core R&D activity or the production of a prototype for experimentation. During a core, the cleaning, maintenance and monitoring of aquaculture tanks that are used to keep fish stocks for the development of a new feed pellet. After a core, the deconstruction of equipment and the disposal of waste items used in the experiment. This concludes the presentation on the assessment of R&D activities. The links provided will take you to relevant areas of the ATO and Oz Industry websites. Additional materials are available on our website, which can be accessed via the link provided. Should you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with our office on the number provided.